I decided to do this recording for you. And for those of you who are listening in, Katie's my granddaughter. She's a student at the University. She's getting a real good dose of critical theory there. So I hope this is helpful. So I want to start off with a 2-minute clip of a father speaking before a public school board in Kirkland, which is not too far from where you live.
I want you to know that the Lake Washington School District in their website is pointing to documentation that shows pictures like this of a so-called gender diverse child. This is a boy dressed as a girl. This is a boy dressed as a girl, and the Lake Washington School District is promoting it by posting it on their website. The other thing that I discovered is that they're using terms like gender diverse. What does that mean? Well, you can look at the other documentation that's shown. For 6th graders, they're recommending, the Lake Washington School District is recommending books titled Transgender and Gender Nonconforming Women of Color. This is for 6th graders. For 5th graders, misgendering and respect of pronouns. What does misgendering mean? Listen to the concept. They want to control language. They want to use the language to force someone to speak in a way that is opposite of what they know is true. That is also known as lying. When you speak a knowing falsehood, when you refer to someone with a pronoun that is the opposite of what they know is true, this is a lie, and it's being proposed through there. Finally, critical race theory. This is an anti-white propaganda. Anti-white propaganda that's intended to encourage citizens to judge not by the content of someone's character, but by the color of their skin. This is not righteous. This is unrighteous. So I'm here to let you know that the sleeping giant has awoken, and I'm speaking on behalf of parents across the nation who are not going to stand silently. I just discovered this.
He says, I just discovered this. And you know, this could be repeated hundreds of times across the country in the last year. And many people are asking, where did this come from? And what is critical race theory? This father says it's anti-white propaganda. You know, those are really strong words. And if it's true, how should we respond? Okay, well, first, I think it's important to understand that critical race theory and critical gender theory are really subsets of a broader umbrella idea called critical theory. Now, critical theory was developed in the 1920s and 30s through the work of a group of intellectuals and political dissidents known as the Frankfurt School. It was called that because it was located in Frankfurt, Germany. Now, it's interesting to note that the primary financier of the Frankfurt School was a man named Felix Weil. And Weil, he named the school the Institute for Marxism. Now, the name of the school was later changed to a more moderate sounding title, Institute for Social Research. Now, Nazi Germany of the 1930s was not a safe place for Jews, and many, if not most of these Frankfurt School participants were ethnic Jews. And so they fled to the United States, and they set up their school in New York City as part of Columbia University, and that was done in 1935. Now, there are subsets of this theory called critical theory that sooner or later came out of the ideology that was developed at the Frankfurt School. For example, there's literary critical theory, there's critical legal theory, there's critical pedagogy, and others. Now, critical race theory actually grew out of critical legal theory in the 1970s. And the person who's given the most credit for this was a Harvard Law School professor by the name of Derek Bell. Now, the first annual Critical Race Theory Conference was held in 1989. And in 1995, that's when efforts began in earnest to get critical race theory into the K-12 public schools. And that was spearheaded by Gloria Ladson-Billings and William Tate. what seems to have suddenly appeared out of nowhere really was a long time coming. Now, behind all forms of critical theory, there is a seemingly noble objective. And that seemingly noble objective is to liberate oppressed people groups from their oppressors. Now, I think you'll agree, who can be against this? Of course, people who are oppressed should be liberated from their oppressors. You and I would both agree with that. But to understand what's meant by this, one has to really understand how critical race and gender theorists define terms like oppressed and oppressors, and he who defines the terms wins the debate. First, let's really understand that the foundation of all forms of critical theory is this, that social systems, and sometimes they call them structures, are composed of two opposing people groups. And those people groups are differentiated by power or lack of power. Two opposing people groups differentiated by power or lack of power. So the so-called systemically dominant group has the power, and the so-called systemically non-dominant group does not have the power. The shorthand way to say it is the oppressors versus the oppressed. Now, I have to tell you that this pigeonholing of all people into one of only two groups based solely upon power is a flawed starting point. And I'll go so far as to say that it's an idea that's truly out of this world. And I don't mean that in a positive sense. I actually call it Toto Cement, in reference to that little dog, that accompanied Dorothy to the land of Oz. And remember her famous statement to Toto, "We're not in Kansas anymore." Now, they didn't intend to leave Kansas, but they were carried away by wind. And they landed in another realm. And that realm, in the end, we find out, turned out to be a dream. But in the case of critical race and gender theory, this is no dream. It's actually happening for real. And you're at the University of, I know your profs are feeding you a lot of critical theory, and they're pouring Toto cement around your feet, so to speak. And the challenge is not to let that cement harden, because the harder it gets, the more difficult it is to get your feet out of it. If you start off with a flawed premise, you'll end up with flawed conclusions. And when you act upon those flawed conclusions, you end up with defective outcomes. Not just defective outcomes, but sometimes they're very damaging outcomes, and ones that can actually split families and churches as well as a whole nation. And that's why this is really important. And perhaps the most damaging outcome of critical race theory, as I see it, is that it produces masses of people who practice wholesale stereotyping by skin tone. And that produces wholesale across the board prejudice, prejudging humans by groups. Now, humans can really only be truly understood as individuals. Now, Martin Luther King, when I was your age, he was trying to get the country to move away from judging people by groups based on skin tone. He tried to move the country toward judging people by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. But critical race theory really is lumping humans into one of two power groups, the oppressed or the oppressors. And then it's stereotyping them according to the amount of melanin they have in their skin. And that, by the way, is a condition over which we have no choice. We have no ability to change. And then critical race theory judges people according to their skin tone. And the outcomes of that kind of thinking can never be good. It's skin deep judgments, and it's based on immutable qualities. That's qualities that people can't change. It's really causing more racism than it's solving. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Back to the Frankfurt School. Now, in classical economic Marxism, the capitalists are the oppressors. The workers are the systemically non-dominant in the economic system. The owners have the power, the workers have none. And classical Marxism focuses on economic class structure and struggle. Now, the uniqueness of the Frankfurt School is that they really expanded the Marxist oppressor-oppressed idea way beyond the sphere of economics to other systems, social systems such as race and sex, and this became known as cultural Marxism. Now, the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci was really helpful to the Frankfurt School in developing what's called cultural Marxism. But, the Frankfurt School didn't just mix Marx with Gramsci. They also mixed him with Kant and Hegel and Freud and others. And these are folks you'll probably run into at the university, adding more Toto Cement to your feet. Now, Marxism of today in critical race theory has been described as third or fourth generation Marxism. You might call it Marxism 3.0 or 4.0. At any rate, in race theory, the systemically dominant group are the whites, and the systemically non-dominant group are called BIPOC. Now, that's an acronym for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. Now, the term was coined fairly recently to get across the idea that not all oppressed people face equal amounts of systemic oppression. Black and Indigenous people are more severely impacted. Now, in critical sex and gender theory, the systemically dominant and non-dominant group members are not identified by skin tone. The oppressors are those who hold to traditional Judeo-Christian norms regarding sexual behavior. Beliefs that have been really considered normative for a long time are now viewed as oppressive because they are dominant. Now, the oppressors hold that homosexual acts are sin, that marriage is between one man and one woman, and there are only two genders, male and female. Now, on the other side, you have the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people who they say must now be liberated from the oppression of dominant Judeo-Christian sexual norms. Now, the person who's most responsible for getting the sexual revolution going back in the 60s, when I was your age, was a Frankfurt School member by the name of Herbert Marcuse. Now, Marcuse wrote a book. It was published in 1955 called Eros and Civilization. And this book really became the so-called Bible of the 1960s sexual revolution. But the 60s sexual revolution didn't end in the 60s. It really is still happening. It's revolutionizing Americans' view of sex, marriage, family, and more recently, gender. So anyway, when it comes to the matter of family structure, the biblical norm of one dad and one mom and kids is now deemed oppressive. Now, it's important to understand that the mere social acceptance is not the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal actually is the elimination of the oppressive Judeo-Christian norms. And this is something a lot of Christians are kind of slow to get here, but perhaps the best book I've read on this topic of eliminating Christianity as normative in America is a book by David Horowitz called Dark Agenda: The War to Destroy Christian America. Anyway, Horowitz is not a Christian. He describes himself as an agnostic Jew, but he was a leader of the far left movement in the 1960s, and he really knows what he's talking about. You see, he understands that the social justice warriors are not playing games. They're really on a mission, and that mission, they feel, is morally a high ground for them. They feel they're doing the right thing because they're freeing people from the oppression of previous norms. And the way they're freeing these people from oppression is they're silencing the oppressors. And that's their idea of justice. Now, critical theory activists, they do this through fear primarily. It's fear of stigma or fear of social rejection. And for many who are in the workforce, it's actually fear right now of losing one's job or position, fear of losing their livelihood, or worse. Now, the outcome of that fear is the elimination of dissent. And that's what we're seeing more and more these days. Even to deny that a man can have a baby, or to refuse to call a female coworker by a male pronoun, that may someday be your ticket out the door when you get into the workforce. And it really is for some right now. You see, if you're guilty of oppression, you forfeit your rights to speak. And this is a huge irony of this whole thing, is that people who are purportedly fighting against oppression are really becoming the biggest oppressors we've seen in this country for years, if ever. Now, Georg or I should say Georg Lukacs. He was a Hungarian Marxist who helped to shape the philosophy of the Frankfurt School back in the 20s and 30s. He famously said many times, he says, "Who will free us from the yoke of Western civilization?" Now, that so-called yoke can be summed up in three words: European, white, and Christian. Now, here's the end game. Critical race and gender theory seek to remove any feelings of abnormality or inferiority among people who do not subscribe to the traditional norms of Western civilization. And these norms are norms in which Christianity plays a pivotal and central role. Now, this removal of feelings of inferiority is done by normalizing the non-traditional norms. And part of the way they do that is by canceling the traditional Western Christian norms, which fall under the broad category of whiteness, which I want to unpack for you shortly. Now, remember, the main idea behind critical theory is to liberate oppressed people groups from their oppressors. So who can be against that? But for critical theory activists, it's not just about liberating the oppressed, it's about canceling the oppressors. And that process is fully underway right now. In a coherent society, you really can't normalize both LGBTQ norms and Judeo-Christian sexual norms. You see, one has to be normative in order to be normative. That's the very definition of the word. Now, how can homosexuality and same-sex marriage be normalized for a class of 6-year-olds? Well, you read books to the class like Heather Has Two Mommies. And by the way, that was written for pre-kindergarten students more than 30 years ago. There's another book called A Tale of Two Daddies, and there are many, many other books to choose from that are written specifically for young children to normalize previously considered abnormal behavior. Some school board personnel are saying we don't teach critical race theory in our schools. Now, it's true that they don't teach formal courses called Critical Race Theory 101, but you don't have to teach formal classes in critical race theory to really impart the key what I call the tenets of the faith, or the assumptions and the implications, or the premises of the ideology. And you can do that through such really positive sounding topics such as cultural competency or diversity or equity or inclusion or social emotional learning. So who in their right mind could be against these things? But you have to remember that it's the way they define the terms and how they spin the solutions that's really, really problematic. And at this point, I want to share some specifics with you because it helps to get specific. So what does equity training actually look like? Well, if you go online, and I encourage you to do this, you can watch an example of equity training. And the title of this session is called Leading with Racial Equity. It was session number 3. I don't know where session number 1 and 2 are, but at least they had session 3 up here. Now, in this session, they showed a chart. Now, in one column, you have the systemically dominant group members, and they're identified very specifically. And on this side, you have people that the system supports and values, and the group members are identified. And then on the other side, you have the people that the system does not support or value. Now, under the column of the systemically dominant group members, they have written here very specifically white people and those of primarily European descent. And then across from that, on the other side of the chart, you have, quote, Black, Brown, Latino, Asian, Pacific Islander, Indigenous, Middle Eastern, and multiracial people, those living in the US whose ancestry is descended from places outside of Europe, and Jewish and Romani people of varied ancestral and national origins, end of quote. So it doesn't get much plainer than this. Now, in the category of faith-based perspectives and religion, as they put it, on the dominant side, they have Christians, Protestants, and Catholics. On the non-dominant side, they have Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Sheiks, Buddhists, and those who do not practice Christianity, end of quote. Again, it's pretty clear cut. Now, On the chart, social category of sex and gender, we see they have men. And on the systemically non-dominant side, they have women, so-called, quote, intersex people, as well as transgender, non-binary, and genderqueer people. Then in the social sphere of sexual orientation, as they put it, there's the straight people on the dominant side and the gay, lesbian, bisexual, queer, pansexual, asexual, and others who don't identify as straight on the non-dominant side. So there's not a lot of room here for misunderstanding who's in which camp. And by the way, if you're a member of more than one category in the non-dominant side, so let's say you're a Black person who's also a lesbian, who's also a Buddhist, that's called intersectionality. And those with the greater intersectionality carry the greater weight in their opinions. And by the way, the most oppressive people on the planet are straight, white, Christian males, particularly old ones like your papa. Let's listen to about 90 seconds of unedited video from the North Kitsap Equity Training, which will help you to get a clear picture of where they're coming from.
And then this one is, I feel like, is the most important one, that I feel is the hardest one, but the most important one. Discovering and cultivating the unique gifts and talents and interests of every human possess. And right now we're going to go talk about when we talk about white supremacy, I gave you the definition last time, but we're going to continue working on it. White supremacy is what upholds what we consider the norm, aka whiteness as the norm. Systemically dominant communities as the norm. What tends to happen if white supremacy is the disease, the symptoms is fragility. For white people and white fragility and some other levels of fragility that's there. There's fragility that happens with income and lots of different things. But the effects of the systemically non-dominant is they leave the best gifts at the door. People of systemically non-dominant identities feel and are encouraged to leave their best gifts at the door by the system. The outcome of all of that is privilege or lack of privilege, systemic privilege.
Okay, so here's the bottom line. That there's a white privileged system built upon white Western Christian norms, by the way, that's causing non-dominant groups such as BIPOC to leave their best gifts at the door. Now that's a soft way of saying we're keeping them down, we're suppressing them. Or you might say we're squelching them. We're the bad guys. Now, this is a fundamental dogma of critical race theory, and here again, this is what makes it difficult, because any system in which people are kept back or kept down from doing their best, that is a system we should condemn. And anybody who really cares about people, those kind of people don't want anyone to leave their best gifts at the door. That is the point of agreement here. But what makes it so difficult to sort through is the supposed cause of this condition they're describing of being held back and the solutions that they're proposing for correcting the problem. The oppression of Western civilization that I said could be boiled down to three words, European, white, and Christian, really are boiled down to one word by today's critical race theorists, and that one word is whiteness. Whiteness is like a cloud of oppression and suppression over BIPOCs. So what is whiteness? Let's go to the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. Last April, this museum published a document titled Aspects and Assumptions of Whiteness and White Culture in the United States. Here we go. White dominant culture, or whiteness, refers to the ways white people and their traditions, attitudes, and ways of life have been normalized over time and are now considered standard practices in the United States. And since white people still hold most of the institutional power in America, we have all internalized some aspects of white culture, including people of color, end of quote. In other words, whiteness is not exclusively a white person's problem. Even people who have more melanin in their skin than you and I do may have internalized some aspects of whiteness. And that's what makes critical race theory confusing at times, because it's possible for a person whose skin tone is dark to actually be white in terms of how they think and act, if they're acting according to so-called white world culture. Now, what exactly are the specific aspects of whiteness that are really so troublesome? Here are some of the key characteristics of whiteness. Self-reliance, the nuclear family, objective linear thinking, history that emphasizes Judeo-Christian tradition, the Protestant work ethic, the idea of work before play, Christianity being the norm, having no tolerance for deviation from a single God concept. Yep, we're in the crosshairs there. Respect for authority is a part of whiteness. Having heavy value on ownership of goods, space, and property. Planning for the future, following rigid time schedules, delayed gratification, observing holidays based on Christian religion, and justice based on English common law. And if you look into that, that's really based on the Bible. You also have protection of property and entitlements is a part of whiteness. The idea that you always have to do something about a situation, that's also part of whiteness. Decision making, the King's English rules, and this one, be polite. So, you know, it really doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand how a lot of so-called aspects of whiteness that they list here could be offensive to many non-whites who are Christians or anyone else who values things such as delayed gratification or being polite. Now, what's really senseless here is making Christianity an aspect of whiteness when you and I know Jesus was a Jew, and Christianity is deeply rooted in Hebrew history and experience, and Christianity came out of the Middle East, and I don't know any Christians who call Europe the Holy Land. Now, this blatant racist publication that we just went through here was published by the museum and was met with such strong pushback that this was taken down after 6 weeks. But when I went to the museum's website, they also have a definition of whiteness that goes like this. Whiteness and white racialized identity refer to the way that white people, their customs, culture, and beliefs operate as the standard by which all other groups are compared. Whiteness is also at the core of understanding race in America. Whiteness and the normalization of white racial identity throughout America's history have created a culture where non-white persons are seen as inferior or abnormal. Now, critical race theory paints all members of one group based on their skin tone, the white group, as racists. Now, that's blatant racist stereotyping of the worst kind. And this is why critical race theory doesn't belong in our schools. It doesn't belong in our government agencies, and it doesn't belong in our places of business. And by the way, don't think that once you get out of the University of that this pouring of Toto Cement is going to stop, because critical race and gender theory is really pandemic right now. It's like a virus. It's everywhere in many, many, many places of business and government agencies as well. Now, those in the group called whites who claim that they are not racists or they're not white supremacists are deemed fragile. Such whites are in denial. They say racism comes so naturally to whites, they don't even realize they're racists. And they must be taught that they are. Thus, the K-12 schools really are an important process in this whole thing. Critical race theory now has a lot of Caucasians thinking that they are blinded by their own white supremacy and that they really are unable to understand that they are at their core racists. Now, note that whiteness was presented by the African American History and Culture Museum as being problematic throughout America's history, which brings us to another point. Why do so many Americans hate America today? And has critical theory really played into that somehow? Well, I'd like to answer that with one name, Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn wrote a book called A People's History of the United States. And that book, by the way, has sold over 2.5 million copies. It's the story of white European oppression, suppression, and dominance, all the way from Christopher Columbus to the Cold War. It really is critical theory on steroids. Now, the first word in critical theory is critical. And the objective of critical theory is to relentlessly and mercilessly criticize the oppressors. That makes it easier to cancel them, because they're the bad guys. And in the case of Howard Zinn, it's the white European Christians that are clearly the bad guys. And to find out what the problem is with what I call Zinn's spin, I really recommend that you read this book called Debunking Howard Zinn by Mary Grauber. Now, there's a more recent phenomenon you might have heard about called the 1619 Project. It's described, I think rightly so, as a new origin story, and it was created, I think that's the right word, by Nicole Hannah Jones. Looks like a very nice lady. And she claims that the United States was founded by slave owners who wanted to build a new nation built upon slavery. And in her story, the Revolutionary War was fought to break away from Britain in order to ensure that slavery in the New World would continue unhindered by England. I would define real racism as prejudging or treating people negatively and giving them, or really giving them preferential treatment based on color of skin or ethnic background. And I would define real injustice as withholding what is rightfully and legally due to someone. And real oppression is burdening people with unreasonable impositions or treating them with unjust severity or rigor or hardship. Now, but the Bible, by the way, is very clear about defending the weak and upholding the cause of the oppressed and not perverting justice by showing partiality. Now, racism in critical race theory is not so much about prejudice. It's more about unequal distribution of resources and power. Injustice is not so much about withholding what's rightfully or legally due. It means an unequal distribution of power again, and it's all about unequal outcomes. That's injustice. It's a state of being or a condition that's brought about by this imbalance, so to speak, of outcomes. And according to this way of thinking, justice then requires some sort of redistribution of power and resources so that it's more or less equally so-called distributed amongst lines of skin tone. Oppression no longer means burdening people with unreasonable impositions or treating them with unjust severity or rigor or hardship. Now, if you are simply a member of the BIPOC group, you are oppressed, whether you realize it or not. We need to think long and hard about this. If people hear enough times that America is systemically racist, with the system being stacked against BIPOCs in favor of whites, so that BIPOCs are oppressed or suppressed by whiteness, and they leave their best gifts at the door because of white systemic privilege. How do you think that might affect the attitude of many non-whites toward whites? Critical race theory is actually causing more real racism and injustice than it's solving. So we need to think really, really deeply about this whole thing. And if it's commonly accepted among the masses that so-called white supremacy or white privilege exists because of resources and power that was accumulated through oppression, it really makes it a lot easier to take back what the oppressed think is rightfully theirs. Now, in summary, let's summarize this as a three-legged stool. Number one, systemically dominant or oppressive people are typically white, of European descent, and Christian, while systemically non-dominant, oppressed people are typically BIPOC. Now, I want to underscore the fact that critical race theory not only does a great disservice to Caucasians by stereotyping white people as oppressive, but it also does a great disservice to BIPOCs because it's stereotyping them as oppressed. Now think about this. Why would a BIPOC child be sent to a school where they're told in so many words, directly or indirectly, that they're really not able to do all they can because they live under a cloud of white oppression? Now, Who wants to get that message, even indirectly, that you can't do this or that because you're Black? If someone hears that often enough, it really can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Critical race theory is doing a huge disservice to the next generation of particularly Black young people. Now, racism, number 2, is reframed in terms of power and oppression, whereby dominant white Western Christian norms cause BIPOCs to feel abnormal or inferior. That's a new definition of racism. Now, the power and oppression theme is not hidden by critical race theory advocates, and sometimes it's plainly spelled out for people, including teachers, although it's not usually shared with the parents. Now, here's a publication that was put out by the Seattle Public Schools in August of 2019. It's the Math Ethnic Studies framework for K-12 students. K, of course, means kindergarten. And so it's starting very early. Now, under the power and oppression column, we read this. I'll read it right to you. Quote, "Power and oppression, as defined by ethnic studies, are the ways in which individuals and groups define mathematical knowledge as to see Western mathematics as the only legitimate expression of mathematical identity and intelligence. This definition of legitimacy is then used to disenfranchise people and communities of color." End of quote. The document goes on to say, SWBAT means students will be able to analyze the ways in which ancient mathematical knowledge has been appropriated by Western culture, and they will be able to identify how math has been and continues to be used to oppress and marginalize people and communities of color. The document goes on to say the students will be able to explain how math and technology and or science are connected, and how technology and or science have been and continue to be used to oppress and marginalize people and communities of color. And then in addition, it says the students will be able to identify the inherent inequities of the standardized testing system used to oppress and marginalize people and communities of color. End of quote. Liberating BIPOCs from the oppression of whiteness is at the heart of social justice. And the goal of social justice is equality of outcomes, which is commonly referred to as equity. I want to underscore here that the word equity does not refer to equality under the law or equality of opportunity. Equity refers to equity or equality of outcomes. The question is, is disparity of outcomes the result of disparity of treatment? Sometimes disparate outcomes might be caused by authentic prejudicial treatment. And if that's the case, that is true racism. But there are other factors that can account for unequal outcomes. We'll never get away from disparate outcomes. And that's the problem here. Only a Marxist would think that that equal outcomes are even possible. And that's pure Toto Cement. It's part of another realm. Now, when unequal outcomes define racism, then there's only one thing you can do to fix the problem of racism, and that's to have equal outcomes. And that is done by force on the part of the government. And we're going to see more and more of that if we don't change directions here. And by the way, let me give you another reading assignment. Thomas Sowell, he's the best, I'll tell you. If you go online and you go to YouTube, look up Thomas Sowell YouTube clips. Some of them are short 5-minute clips. Boy, those are tremendous. But he wrote a book called Discrimination and Disparities that'll really blow your mind. Now, I want to bring this plane in for a landing by addressing the question, what do we do here? What should parents do or other concerned citizens about critical race and gender theory? Now, I know you're not a parent, and some of what I'm going to share here now is part of your future. So I want you to start thinking about this. There really are 4 things that we can do to help make a change here. And I really recommend that we take the long view, like the Frankfurt School did. Okay, first of all, we can advocate for school transparency, particularly public school transparency. What I mean here is that parents can specifically ask local public school leaders to identify their diversity, equity, and inclusion training materials. Parents can request that these materials be made public They can be made public on websites, and parents can ask first that they do that. Now, if the asking doesn't get anything done, then they can go to public disclosure laws to get these things made public. Posting the training materials will allow parents to do their homework, like that father did in the Lake Washington School District. And parents need to really be specific about their concerns about critical race and gender theory. If they're not specific, that's not going to go very far. So they need to be able to know what is being taught, what's in the curriculum, what's in the library, and that's an important part of advocating. Number two, we have to gain majorities on the school boards. Now, I am suggesting that parents and taxpayers really work strategically to gain the majority vote on the school boards. There's usually, I think there's only 7 members, so it's not difficult to get the majority vote. It just takes an effort, and I think strategic planning. And not everybody's wired to be a school board member, and for those that aren't wired or don't have the stomach for it, they can get behind others who do, and they can support them. Now, people who want to run for school board positions can learn how to do that at this website. It's called leadershipinstitute.org. There's a free course there called How to Run for School Board and When. I recommend that course. Number 3, and this is something you can do, and that's to support school choice. If people really want to do something about injustice in the system, in the educational system, and they really want to help disadvantaged BIPOCs or anyone that's disadvantaged, they can support school choice. And that means we need to have school choice, because right now there's a monopoly on the public school system, and it's not right. We need to liberate all children, no matter what their skin tone is, from the oppression, and I would call it oppression, true oppression, of the current system of school funding. It's flat wrong. It's unjust. It's keeping kids, whether they're BIPOC or white or whatever, in chains, so to speak. And let me say very quickly what I mean by that is that disadvantaged children of all skin tones are chained to one option for their education if their parents can't afford an alternative, or both parents are working and they can't homeschool. This situation is flat unjust. It's real injustice. And we should be fighting for this truly oppressive injustice that affects more disadvantaged kids than advantaged kids. We've got to get school choice in Washington State and other states as well. Okay, here's number 4. And I think this is one you can relate to particularly, and it's something you don't need to wait for. And that is, we have to love our neighbors as ourselves. I know you know your Bible, and you know that the Bible says that love is not proud. Well, there's no place for supremacy, white or black, in authentic love. But here's another thing about authentic love. It does not keep a record of wrongs suffered. Now, critical race theory purports to liberate the oppressed through redistributing power and resources from one group to another, and they'll do that by force if necessary. But critical race theory is totally silent about forgiveness. I've listened to a lot of things on critical race theory, listened to critical race theorists, and I've never heard them talk about forgiveness. Critical race theory really keeps a record of wrongs suffered. That's not helping to solve the problem. Now, I'm not saying students shouldn't learn about American history, true history, slavery, or Jim Crow laws, but the teaching on forgiveness is conspicuously absent from critical race theory. Critical race theory really majors on the past offenses. It rehearses the past white, European, and Christian sins. And you've probably heard a lot of this already at the U, and you're going to hear a lot more of the evils of the past. True love rejoices in the truth. Now, you don't have kids, but when the time comes, I do advise you not to put your kids in the public school. I really urge you to find other ways to educate them. Find ways that reinforce the truth with a capital T. And, you know, in my case, your dad and his 3 siblings had no choice, because, you know, I was the principal of a Christian school for 14 years, and I had compulsory attendance at the school. Was I oppressing your dad? by forcing him to attend the Christian school where I was the principal. Well, actually, I don't see it that way. I see myself as being a responsible parent. And I do believe I was doing my best to liberate my 4 kids. So in conclusion, let's remember that in this country, a civil war was waged. And that civil war led to the abolition of slavery. That happened in the 1860s. Now, in the 1960s, many of the freedoms that were gained on paper were realized in real life, thanks to the efforts, by the way, of a Baptist pastor. We need to remember that the original civil rights movement was motivated by overtly Christian norms. We made a lot of progress. And it's a progress, by the way, that critical race theory is now reversing by producing a new kind of racism and division, the likes of which we haven't seen in this country for many years. Now, it's true, real injustice, real racism existed in 1619, and it continued long after, to one degree or another. We had really unspeakable things in our past history, like lynching and redlining by banks where they wouldn't give loans to certain neighborhoods where there were a lot of BIPOCs. You know, those are things that we never want to go back to. Racism, I think you know this, it's not a skin problem, it's a sin problem. And it's a problem that affects the human heart. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here, you know all this stuff, but we need a heart solution to this problem. We all need a heart transplant. And you know there's only one surgeon capable of doing that, and that's surgeon with a capital S, and that is Jesus. And we really need another great awakening. We've had 2 in this country, and we're long overdue for a third. That's what I see as the hope for our future. And I'll leave you with that. Thanks for listening. See you later. I love you. Bye-bye.